we noticed, so my co-author on my book, The Rise of Victimhood Culture, is Jason Manning, who's a sociologist at West Virginia University, and he was a fellow grad student at the University of Virginia, and was also supervised, his dissertation was supervised by Donald Black, so he was also interested in the same theoretical approach. And after we had both left grad school, and he was at West Virginia and I was at Cal State Los Angeles, we were kind of communicating about some things we would see. So it was actually 2013 when we started noticing something was odd. I had actually started paying attention to some things before then. I hadn't, some of the things I'd been noticing were long before 2013. So I had been interested in hate crime hoaxes for a while, just as something that, I mean, I'm interested in peculiar behavior, at looking at conflict and how people handle conflicts. I had read a lot about what sociologists call moral panics and witch trials. I'd read about the Salem witch trials and the Red Scare in the 1950s. And
those are examples of moral panics?
Moral panics. So the idea was that people suddenly become interested in some particular issue, either witches are out to get us or communists are out to get us. And sometimes they may be, there may be some underlying basis for it, like there really were communists. There weren't really
witches.
There weren't really witches, but they were doing the things that they said, causing babies to die and crops to fail and things like that. So you could have false accusations and false claims in these things, but that doesn't mean people don't believe it. And so a lot of sociologists had tried to understand, why are there moral panics? Why were, what accounts for the Salem witch trials? So I was already interested in and teaching about that kind of thing. And it was just kind of fascinating to me that I would see from time to time on college campuses where there would be what some people have called a hate crime hoax. So, for example, in 2004 at Claremont McKenna College, there was a woman who was teaching psychology there at Claremont McKenna. Her name was Carrie Dunn, and she was about to give a speech for an anti-racism event on campus. And before doing so, she vandalized her own car, wrote anti-Semitic slurs on it. Somebody saw her, so
she did that to herself?
Yes, so to make it look like she was the victim of racist anti-Semites.
Wow.
It was discovered that she had done it herself. She was charged and I think spent some time in jail over it. But
what was she charged with?
False report to the police. She made
right.
So
and a hate crime.
Yeah, if she had just if she just publicly claimed it, I don't think that's a crime. But if you report it to the police that somebody's vandalized your car, it's probably all kinds of crimes. So in these cases aren't usually punished. Hers was, but there had been, and this kind of thing would happen at other universities. You'd see it from time to time. And it was just fascinating to me, not just that the incidents would occur so much, but the reaction to them. So there would be vigils, sometimes classes would be canceled, each time kind of reacting without any kind of skepticism. So why aren't people more skeptical in these situations? Why don't they check them out, have the police check them out first before reacting? And so that was kind of what I was interested in. You saw people, again, not as some organized movement, but just like sort of random individuals associated with the movements who were claiming victimhood that didn't happen. So I was already kind of interested in that and had written a bit about it. And I was kind of thinking too about just more generally, when do people make false accusations of all kinds, whether to the police or to others? When do false accusations occur in conflict and things like that? So I was interested in that, and I was following some events at Oberlin College, and this is in 2013. There was some graffiti on campus, racist graffiti. There had been a big uproar about it at campus. It wasn't clear to me whether who was the source of the graffiti. Was it a hoax? What happened? What it ended up being was that there were pranksters who were trying to get a rise out of people. They weren't actually racist, but I was interested in that and following that. And then during that time, when there's already an uproar about the graffiti on campus at Oberlin, someone said that they spotted a Ku Klux Klansman on campus. they shut down classes at Oberlin in response to this.
Whoa.
And reading about this, Jason Manning and I were talking, and it didn't seem likely to us that there was like a Klan chapter at
I was going to
Oberlin
say
College.
they like someone dressed in the full garb, because otherwise how would you know?
Somebody in Klan regalia was what they thought. It turned out it was somebody wrapped in a blanket. It was a mistaken claim, So somebody
in just like a white blanket.
Somebody at night saw somebody out in the cold wrapped in a blanket, thought they saw a Klansman, reported it. Classes shut down at Oberlin. Right? Police investigated. They find out it was a person in a blanket, which seemed to us to be the most likely explanation to begin with. That it was some mistake, rather than that there was a Klan chapter at Oberlin. Oberlin is a famously progressive school, so it's so the students there tend to be concerned with progressive causes, anti-racism, and those kinds of things. And so it was kind of interesting to us as sociologists who study morality and moral conflict. Why was it that the students there at this incredibly progressive place, more so than in other areas of society, were so quick to think of it as a hotbed of racism, that there are Klansmen around and all these racists? And as we were reading about that, we then discovered something that was even more fascinating to us, that there was a website called Oberlin Microaggressions. This was the first time we had heard of a microaggression. So the term had been around since the 1980s, but it was pretty obscure. Nobody had really heard of it until 2013 and after. But then it became really popular. But this was the first we had heard of it. And a microaggression is, the idea is that it's a slight. It can be an unintentional slight or insult directed against a disadvantaged group, so against a minority ethnic group or women or so on. And it's a microaggression, so the idea is it's small, it's a slight, and maybe even unintentional. But the idea is that the microaggressions add up over time, so that people experience lots of them, and that it ends up causing great harm. So
and what are some examples of
microaggressions? So on the Oberlin Microaggressions website that we saw initially, there were some students were publicizing their microaggressions through that. One example was a student said that she was in the gym and she overheard one of her professors, a white professor, saying to someone else, "Oh, I'm glad both my husband and I have blue eyes, because then our children will have blue eyes." And then the comment the student made was, "I don't want to hear casual racism from my professors." So this was defined as racism, a small microaggression, because the woman was saying she's glad she has blue eyes. Something overheard in the gym. There was also a student who had complained about a Hispanic student complaining about a non-Hispanic white student using the word football, the Spanish football for soccer. And the comment that he made about it was, keep my heritage language out of your mouth." Now, these are more extreme examples, but those were some of the examples on the website. What others have said are microaggressions. There's really a range. So some are things that other people outside the group of activists wouldn't see as very offensive or offensive at all, but others are things that would clearly be offensive. So on the kind of clearly offensive side, people have given examples like someone saying to the white mother of a black child, "Oh, is this child really yours?" Right? Or something like that, right? So these kinds of things that are rude or offensive behaviors. And then on the other side, the things like mentioned, but also people have talked about where are you from as a microaggression. And so the idea is that it means if it's directed to a Hispanic person or an Asian person, that it means you don't belong here in this country, right? So where are you from? It's also kind of a staple of conversation, though. So people ask it to try to understand people's background. It's a sort of opening question, especially in cities where people tend not to be from there. So again, that's the kind of thing a lot of people would see as non-offensive. Even if you're inquiring about somebody's background, they would see it as kind of not, just curiosity. But others see it as offensive. Again, these are disputes people have. We're not. We weren't initially kind of interested so much in taking sides about the disputes, what's offensive is not or not offensive, but in trying to understand it. Why are people making these kinds of claims that they wouldn't have made in the past or in other environments, right? It's taking things as offensive that wouldn't be seen as offensive in other environments, or even calling attention to small offenses, right? Even so, we had so it was interesting that it was happening at Oberlin too, a very progressive place where, and then you have like people, in an uproar about racist graffiti because of, a much more serious offense if it was real,
if
right?
it's real, yeah.
Or a Klansman, certainly,
Yeah.
a problem
Yeah.
on campus if there's really a Klansman. But then also kind of concerned with these microaggressions, small offenses, and publicizing them. There's a 19th century sociologist, Emile Durkheim, who wrote about morality, and he had famously said, even in a society of saints, there would still be sinners. So this is kind of a famous quote in sociology, and the meaning is just that people will find things that are offensive, right? So there's always deviant behavior in any kind of group. So even his idea was like, if you had a society of saints, so it's people who are very good, there would be some people who weren't as saintly as others. They would still be condemned and ostracized by the group, right? So like that any social group will find bad behavior to punish. So that's the idea. Like it seems the slightly less saintly behavior seems more severe in a society of saints.
Right.
So
That makes sense. Actually.
so even in a society of saints, there would still be sinners. So we thought, well, is this what's happening at Oberlin, right? That it's a very progressive and anti-racist place. So tiny, small acts of racism are cause lots of conflict and are seen as very offensive and problematic, or even kind of a quickness to define things as racist that aren't at least intentionally so. So we were fascinated by this idea of microaggression and where it was occurring. It was a new kind of moral claim to say, yeah, even these slights matter, these unintentional slights. So we started trying to understand what it meant to make a microaggression claim, like what it meant sociologically. So, and then thinking of some of the other trends that were going on too, which I'll get to. But so for one thing, it was a claim of a slight, of a small offense. So if you have an environment where people are concerned about microaggressions, one thing is that there's a greater sensitivity to slight than in other kinds of environments. So sensitivity to slight, I mean, what we mean by sensitivity is just, again, that they're calling attention to even minor offenses, right? Not ignoring them, not saying, oh, it doesn't matter. So sensitivity to slight. And then that was the idea of appeals to third parties. So one way of handling conflict is just to handle it yourself. So if somebody slighted you, you could go talk to them about it. So one way would be to ignore it, but we see in this environment they're sensitive to slight. So if they do something, then what do? They could go talk to them about it. They could use violence, all these kinds of direct ways of handling it. But another way of handling conflict is to appeal to third parties, to tell someone else about it, maybe to get an authority involved or at least someone else to bring awareness to it. And that's what they were doing here through the microaggression websites that we saw at Oberlin, and then there were other examples. They were appealing to third parties, saying, look what's happening, right? These microaggressions are
this
happening.
This website, it was just a website where people were just posting microaggressions towards them?
Yeah, so it was Oberlin Microaggressions, so they would just list microaggressions that happened here at Oberlin College.
Comment a post being like, this happened to me today?
Yeah, and then there was another one called the Microaggressions Project, which people around the country could contribute to, which also had a lot of examples. And there were others at other universities at the time we were looking. Kind of the microaggression websites don't seem to have continued as much, but partly because the concept was taken up elsewhere. So you've gotten people calling attention to it in other forms, and also more recently asking university administrators to intervene to stop microaggressions. So we saw this so that was part of the appeal to third parties and ultimately appeal to authorities, telling the university administration, well, you have to stop this. You have to stop these microaggressions and do something about it. So we're thinking in broad terms about how people define and handle conflicts. So we thought, well, what's going on in this situation that's different than what you could see? Sensitivity to slight, appeal to third parties, And the other was this focus on their own victimhood. So this also isn't a given. So in some environments, people might want to portray themselves as very strong and capable of handling their own conflicts, but they were portraying themselves as weak and in need of defense. Again, like the idea wouldn't be that there's anything wrong with all these necessarily. We're starting with just trying to understand what's going on and how that differs from the way we might see people think of and handle conflicts in other environments. So it's these three things that we started with: sensitivity to slight, appeal to third parties, and ultimately appeal to authorities, and this focus on victimhood. So that's kind of the characteristics of what's going on. And then what we wanted to do is try to look at it in broader terms and see, well, what are alternatives? What are other ways of handling conflict? When else do we see these ways? And then how do we explain it? So that was kind of how the beginning of our discussion was isn't this an unusual phenomenon sociologically, and how could we go about explaining it? And so we started drawing from kind of our own sociological knowledge on that. So we had done a lot of work on violence, so looking at violence as a way of handling conflict. I teach a course in violence, and so this is something I talk about a lot with the classes. And one thing we talk about in the study of violence often is honor culture. So in many traditional societies, people, there was a form of social status that's usually called honor, which has to do with primarily with people's reputation for physical bravery. So these are the kinds of societies where men fight duels. That's not not all honor cultures have duels, but if they have duels, that's kind of a result of honor culture. So in a duel, somebody has been offended by someone else, and then they challenge them to a fight of some kind. So we talk about in the book that the duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. So famous duel, 1804, and which is also something that we're interested in, like these unusual things. And I think like when you look in the past and you see, wow, a sitting vice president, Aaron Burr, killed a man in a duel. This is 1804. Well, that's a different kind of culture and different society. Yeah. So the duel between Hamilton and Burr was started because Aaron Burr, who was the vice president of the United States at the time, thought that Alexander Hamilton, who was founding father, former Treasury Secretary, thought that he had been slurring his character and that he had evidence of it. So, Hamilton thought very poorly of Burr, and he let people know this. And so Burr writes him a letter, and they end up exchanging letters. Burr is accusing him of saying things about him. Hamilton won't take it back. They end up arranging a duel. Hamilton first fires a gun at Burr, then Burr returns fire and hits Hamilton and kills him. So that's what you might see in an honor culture. And you see this is very different than the way we would expect people to handle conflicts. One thing is that we would normally say, first of all, just ignore the insult. So in honor cultures, people are very sensitive to slight. They're quick to, at least to certain kinds of slight, they're quick to perceive themselves as being insulted, as being put down by someone else. The second thing is, in an honor culture, you don't appeal to third parties, like to other people to get involved in it. The idea is that you're able to handle it yourself. So you do handle it through violence, in this case a duel, but the idea is that you want to project the image of being courageous, tough, willing to engage in violence, partly so that others don't put you down and intimidate you. And so
this is so interesting. You're saying this. We had on Coleman Hughes, and he mentioned this exact thing of honor cultures being used in, say, like gang communities, gang culture, and the way that you're describing it is exactly how I would describe, how I would think, gang communities. They don't, generally don't use authorities, like don't go to the cops. They take care of business themselves, very sensitive to what a lot of people would consider minor offenses. Right. So it's so interesting.
It's exactly, yeah. So, And that's one of the issues. A lot of people have written about the decline of honor, but it hasn't disappeared. It exists among gangs, for instance. That's a place where we see really a full-blown honor culture, just like you see in the past, and has lots of things that are similar. To the so outsiders typically will see the offenses as as you're saying, like trivial. You killed someone over a pair of shoes, or something like that. But it's about being insulted and being put down, there's a book by Elijah Anderson from the 1990s. Elijah Anderson is a sociologist at the University of Pennsylvania. He wrote a book called Code of the Street, and it was about an African-American community in inner city Philadelphia, and he talks about the code of the street that they use, which is a kind of honor culture, an honor code. Again, that they were sensitive to being disrespected, that they often use violence in response. And you also mentioned this kind of like they don't go to police, so that's often part of honor cultures too, that it would be dishonorable to go to the police because you're supposed to be able to handle your conflicts, the conflicts yourself. So we taught and thought a lot about honor cultures, and then when people had talked about the decline of honor, a lot of sociologists and historians had talked about honor culture as having been replaced with dignity culture. So the idea is that we had moved from a culture of honor to a culture of dignity. And the idea was that dignity is something that's different from honor. Honor is a kind of social status that results from your reputation for bravery and sometimes for other things. But dignity was the idea that every person has an inherent worth, right, as a human being. And so if you've got dignity, then it wasn't like honor that you could lose. Dignity is something you can't lose. So the idea was it's inalienable, right? The idea was that if somebody insults you, then you can ignore the insult because you have dignity regardless of what they've said to you. So in a dignity culture, you might tell people, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Say that, because you don't have to worry about words, right? You can ignore those. And then if there's an injury, sticks and stones, then you can go to the police or the courts. So everything is very different. In dignity cultures, you're told not to be sensitive to slight. You're supposed to have thick skin, right? Don't let it bother you. And you're told not to handle conflicts yourself, certainly not through violence. You might talk to people about something, but if it's severe enough, if it's a severe injury, then you go to the police, you use the courts.
You do get that third party involved.
Yeah, you appeal to the authorities. There's no shame in it now. And so, but the idea is that as long as it's a minor offense, just ignore it. So when we started thinking about what was happening on college campuses and the new moral claims that the campus activists were making, things like microaggressions, we thought, well, on the one hand, there's this sensitivity to slight, similar to what you might see in an honor culture. It's over. The slights aren't slights about the same things, right? But it's minor offenses. So, when people think like, oh, these microaggressions are minor, why are you upset by that? Well, someone in an honor culture would at least understand why minor offenses might be very bad, right? Like,
yeah, that's true.
In their view, it would be, oh, you've lowered my status. And from the view of the microaggression framework people were using, it's that microaggressions are important because they cause oppression, right? They build up and they cause oppression, right? They're small things in of themselves, each one is, but ultimately they harm oppressed groups that are already oppressed. So there's sensitivity to slight, at least a certain kind of slight, in this new culture that we saw emerging. Then there's an appeal to third parties, though. So it's not like, appeals to authorities and other third parties. So whereas in honor cultures, you're handling it yourself, here they're going to administrators, to the broader public, asking for help. And also the focus on victimhood, on weakness, on an inability to handle it yourself was different than honor cultures where people wanted to project toughness, right? So even though in honor cultures people were incredibly sensitive to slight, the idea was that, oh, that hasn't really harmed me, I can handle it, So we saw a new kind of culture that wasn't really honor culture or dignity culture. it was something different from both of these. It combined a kind of sensitivity to slight with appeals to third parties and a concern with victimhood. And also, again, like it wasn't just any kind of slight. So there was the notion that it was slights that further oppression, that further the oppression of a group that's already been victimized. So that was important too, because the notion wasn't that everybody should just, abandon sticks and stones may break my bones and take offense at everything. It was that certain kinds of offenses matter, right? So where are you from or those kinds of things were wrong when they were directed toward a minority group and furthering their oppression in some way. That was the claim, but again, it's not just any slight that matters, not just any small offense. So we thought there's a new kind of moral culture here, right? So it's something different from honor and dignity. And you could call it social justice culture if you wanted to. We've thought about different names because people have sometimes objected to ours. That would be fine. People are pursuing a vision of social justice, so that does point to the fact that there's a moral culture here, like a new moral culture. The people have it's not that people just got. A lot of the people opposed to these kinds of things will call people snowflakes and all these kinds of things, as if they're just, it's just they're oversensitive and can't cope with the world. But it's not that. They're making moral claims that they're serious about. So it's a new kind of moral culture arising, and we ended up calling it victimhood culture because we wanted to focus on victimhood as a kind of status. So social justice culture would be fine too, but one thing we wanted to point to was that there were similar kinds of trends spreading outward, and that even conservatives and people who were opposed to the campus activists were also kind of adopting claims of victimhood. So, but also that victimhood was becoming a kind of status, just like honor might be in an honor culture. So, in an honor culture, then you have status based on your reputation for bravery. The opposite of bravery is cowardice, right? So the opposite of honor is cowardice. So it's very bad to be a coward in an honor culture, and that can make you a target and these kinds of things. So what were they concerned about in this new kind of culture? People who were thought of as victims, or especially members of victimized groups were given a kind of status, a social status, and this doesn't mean people are trying to be victims or something. Sometimes they might be, but it means that the reaction is to give people. So sometimes there's the idea, well, because people belong to a victim group, then they have more authority to speak on a certain topic, right? Or again, like with microaggressions, certain kinds of words directed toward those groups matter, but not toward other groups, right? So it's a kind of moral status, just like honor is a kind of moral status in some cultures, but victimhood acts as a kind of moral status here. And the opposite of being a victim is being privileged or being an oppressor, right? So there was a lot of concern with privilege and calling that out and having people recognizing it, check their privilege. So we thought of like privilege is treated kind of like cowardice would be in an honor culture. It's stigmatized. And also, there's the difference in, what kinds of words and statements might be directed toward an oppressor group or toward a victim group. So there's that kind of framework of oppression and victimhood is used to analyze an array of things, right? And to everything from everyday interactions to policies and so on. So this is what we were seeing then is this new kind of culture, a victimhood culture or social justice culture, whatever we call it, but it was a new moral culture because it made claims different from those that you might see in honor and dignity cultures. And we saw it, it wasn't just microaggression complaints, that was kind of one aspect of it, but we also began to hear at the same time about trigger warnings, about safe spaces. So trigger warnings, it comes from what somebody with trauma might be triggered by something. Now, in reality, a trigger can be almost anything. So if somebody who's been victim of violence and these kinds of things, it might be something about the environment in which they were victimized that triggers their trauma. It could be a certain smell or all kinds of things. So there are really things that can trigger people's trauma. That's a
Sure,
real thing.
PTSD.
Yeah, and so but what started happening is that students were asking for trigger warnings for course content. So it would be like, if you're dealing with violence, if you were something dealt with rape or another kind of violence, or even it got expanded to all kinds of things though, even if something portrayed oppression or inequality. And people were asking for trigger warnings even for things like The Great Gatsby and other kinds of major works. So again, the idea was that it was portraying people as, especially people who were victims, as being prone to trauma, to being triggered and in need of protection, right? We need these trigger warnings about course material, not something that you just deal with one case at a time, but that you have to be proactive and give trigger warnings, right, for all kinds of course material so people could avoid it. Then safe spaces, another term we hadn't heard before 2013 or so.
I don't even think we had safe spaces when I was in college. That's a new term for me too.
Yeah, it's fairly new, especially in the way that it's used. I mean, a lot of these terms had been used in other ways, but and then even now there's different ways that safe space might be used. It can just mean to be that a certain group of people have a place where they can get together with one another and talk like an organization or a group. But what it's come to mean, or the way it's been used on a lot of college campuses, is that people need a safe space where their ideas aren't challenged. So there was an incident at Brown University where a speaker was coming in who was going to talk about rape culture. There was going to be a debate actually about it between someone who considered herself, both of them considered themselves feminists, but one person was against, I think she considered herself a libertarian feminist, and she was against the concept of rape culture. This is something that's used by a lot of feminists and others, and the idea is usually that there's a rape culture on college campuses, or maybe in the United States more broadly, and these are cultural characteristics that would lead people to rape. The criticism of it tends to be, is to just say, well, if the incident of rape is lower in these environments than it is in many countries across the world, right, in other kinds of cultures, is it really helpful to think of that as a rape culture, right? Is it helpful in a comparative perspective? So that's a debate, but regardless of and they were going to have a debate about it, but some of the students didn't want the debate to even occur and thought even that was harmful to them, right? Even the fact that whether there was a rape culture on campus at all was being debated was harmful. So they set up a safe space where people could go during the talk if they were too traumatized, and it had coloring books and Play-Doh that people could play with and things like that.
I think, was this with Christina Hoff Sommers?
I think it was someone else.
Okay. Then I think she's had the same experience.
Yeah, she's had similar experiences,
and I didn't know, I think the first time I heard her say that, I didn't know she was saying that as a joke. Because I think where she was, they were playing videos of puppies.
Oh, yeah.
And playing Bubbles.
And you thought it was,
and I thought she was like just making fun of the concept of a safe space. But
right. No, there were literally coloring books and stuff. No, this was Wendy McElroy, who is, but it probably makes some of the arguments similar to Christina Hoff Sommers. I don't know exactly what the argument was, but it was an argument against the idea of rape culture, which she makes too. But yeah, literally a place with coloring books and that kind of thing where people could go. And a lot of this stuff, this is kind of what was fascinating to us too, is a lot of this stuff, when you would talk about it initially, people would think we were joking or exaggerating or something. Even the concept of microaggressions, people at first were kind of like, if you talked about it, it was like, oh, you're just kind of, that's some crazy campus activist, that doesn't really matter. And then all of a sudden the word started being used everywhere, in training sessions for faculty and students, and now so recently in the School of Public Health at Harvard, they now have questions about microaggressions on faculty evaluation forms, right? So student evaluation forms when they evaluate the professor. So they're asked if they've experienced any slights or something.
Oh,
There's a question
wow.
like that, and they found the report was that there were 3 classes where that got more than 3 students saying yes, and that they were going to investigate those faculty members, right? So we've gone from a term no one ever heard of to something people first thought was some kind of joke or maybe a little extreme, and then to something that you can now be investigated for in some places, certainly like the School of Public Health at Harvard. So the term microaggression, got very big very fast. So did trigger warning, safe spaces. Safe space is sometimes used to for the whole university. Like the claim, well, isn't just that we should have this small safe space here that people can go to if they need to retreat from the talk, but sometimes the idea is then, well, the whole university should be a safe space, so we shouldn't have the speaker here at all. And again, it's being used then to say like you're not safe if there are these people who disagree with kind of the dominant ideology, the more left-wing ideology. So, and also notice the word safe. So you're unsafe if it happens. So like this was another new kind of claim we began seeing, that speech was violence. It was just like violence, something. So you're actually unsafe by hearing these ideas. And some people would claim directly that speech could be violence. That when you'd have speakers come to campus, arguing about these topics, and some of them, and some of them were kind of rabble rousers, Milo Yiannopoulos and people like that they were bringing in. So people who were coming in deliberately to make people angry, yeah. So and saying very provocative things. But that's the thing, is not all of them were. So it ranged from people like Milo Yiannopoulos who were coming in deliberately to get a rise out of the left, and then
Wasn't there an incident with Condoleezza Rice?
Probably, yeah. I think I read it. And so, yeah, major figures like Condoleezza Rice, and then intellectuals like Charles Murray at Middlebury, then faculty members, kind of being, chased off campus and or surrounded and yelled at. So it was a range of people who were kind of the subject to these various attacks. But it was all the idea that they're making people unsafe, that their words are actually violent. So this was another kind of new concept that we saw, speech as violence. And you can see if speech is violence, then it's pretty short step to say that we can use violence in response to it, because usually most people who are anti-violence generally believe in violence for self-defense, at least in some circumstances. And it was actually after Milo Yiannopoulos came to Berkeley, so there were riots at Berkeley, property damage, physical attacks, and all this thing, and the talk was shut down. They didn't hold the talk. Afterward, there was a series of articles, like a collection of articles, in a student-run newspaper. I think it's an independent newspaper, but it was called "Violence as Self-Defense." I think was the name of the collection of articles, and it was making the case that the rioters were correct. They were actually defending us, and some of the people who wrote the articles said they had participated in them, but the idea was that if the university won't protect us, we have to protect ourselves. So the idea is that we're appealing to the university administrators, step in, stop these people from talking. So that's then again the appeal to third parties. And violence isn't the first resort like it would be in an honor culture, but it is sometimes the second resort, right? So if they won't help us, then we can step in and use violence. And so this is a very so in dignity cultures, there's a big distinction between speech and violence. And then again, this is kind of reverting back to honor cultures where you use violence in response to insults, not just other violence. But it's the distinction between speech and violence is is something that we've long had, and I think people aren't realizing how dangerous it is to blur that, right? That you're legitimizing riots, not just for extreme speakers, but ultimately for all kinds of any. Again, it's not just Milo Yiannopoulos that speakers object to. So so these are some of the trends that have been going on. We first noticed it in 2013, started thinking about it. We published an article in late 2014 about microaggressions. It's called Microaggression in Moral Cultures. It was in an academic journal, in a sociology journal. But it ended up getting some attention in the fall of 2015. And this was around the time that there was an article in The Atlantic called The Coddling of the American Mind.
By Jonathan Haidt?
Yeah, so Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt wrote this article, The Coddling of the American Mind, and they wrote about these same things that we had been interested in, microaggression, trigger warnings, safe spaces. And their argument was that it was likely to harm the very people it was supposed to help. So they drew from cognitive behavioral psychology, where the idea is that one of the causes of depression and anxiety is the negative thoughts people have, or the bad, the incorrect thoughts. So the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy is to train yourself to think better and to avoid certain kinds of cognitive errors. So they warn against catastrophizing, for instance. So catastrophizing would be always thinking like the worst possible outcome is going to happen. If this bad thing happens, the worst thing will come of it. Or mind reading, like that this person thinks this bad thing about me, right? Or emotional reasoning, kind of just responding to your emotions. And these were, or blaming, like the idea is that others are the source of your problems, right? So what they said is things like microaggression claims
they don't do any of those things.
Yeah, it's the opposite of all the advice that you would get from cognitive behavioral psychology. So it's saying like, actually other people are the source of your problems because of their their microaggressions against you. They, even if they didn't intend it, right? Or this is what it really means, right? So it's a kind of mind reading and catastrophizing, right? It causes all these problems.
And thinking about it all the time.
Right.
Because if these things are happening every day or in their classes or you see a person wearing a towel, whatever, you're constantly being reminded of how victimized you are.
Yeah. And so it's so what they said is then you're essentially teaching people with these concepts like safe spaces and microaggressions. You're teaching people the very errors that you would try to get them to avoid in cognitive behavioral psychology and likely causing depression and anxiety. So it was actually a very interesting point, because usually when we would think of what we've called victimhood culture, when you think of like the victims of victimhood culture, you might think of like the people who are accused of microaggressions, right? So so who are the victims of victimhood culture? It might be, well, all those people who are now being said that they've done something very bad when they ask somebody where they're from, or more serious things. What about the speaker who gets shut down and is not allowed to speak on campus, or even the people who want to hear them, right? So those are, it's possible to point to them as the victims of victimhood culture, but it's also a good question of whether any of that even helps the victims, like the people that you're trying to help, right? So it would be one thing if it were a trade-off, like it's bad for whites and for conservative speakers and things like, but we're actually forming a better environment here. But if it's actually also bad for racial minorities and others who you're teaching to think this way, then what's the point of it all, right? It's not even about trade-offs. It's bad all around. So that was their argument, and it was very important argument in that, because and who are the victims of victimhood culture? It might even be the very people you're trying to help. So they made that argument based on cognitive behavioral psychology. We contacted them about our article, and Haidt wrote about it on his blog, and so it started getting some attention then. But it was kind of fascinating to us because we had written about this in late 2014. And then people were talking about it this time with Coddling of the American Mind, and so people talking about our article too. And exactly like at that point, like right then in the fall of 2015, several campuses kind of exploded with these victimhood eruptions, you might think of them as. This was when there was an event at Yale with Nicholas Christakis and Erica Christakis, who were Nicholas Christakis is a sociology professor at Yale. His wife Erica is, I believe, a psychologist who was teaching there too. But they were together, the directors, they were called at the time Masters of Silliman College, which was a residential college at Yale. So students lived there, and they would often have faculty as the masters who would be there to interact with students, kind of mentor them, and they'd have discussions and these kinds of things. So Erica and Nicholas Christakis were these masters or headmasters at this residential college at Yale. There was an email sent out by a Yale administrator about Halloween costumes, like shortly before Halloween, warning them about offensive Halloween costumes. Stay away from things that might offend, cultural appropriation, and all kinds of other things. Erica Christakis then wrote an email to her community, the residential college. And this apparently wasn't anything unusual to send out kind of emails about discussion topics, but she was just questioning whether Halloween costumes were something the university needed to concern itself with. Was it actually administrators who needed to be telling us, telling students how to dress for Halloween, or could the students kind of deal with this themselves? It wasn't some big polemical email. It wasn't. She wasn't ranting about snowflakes or people being triggered or anything like that. It was really. You can go look at it. It's really thoughtful.
Oh, it's
kind
public?
of email. Yeah. It's easy to should be easy to find. It's really thoughtful because as people discussed it, it was made public. A thoughtful email, just not even necessarily arguing this, actually raising it as a question. Whose responsibility is it? And she was just saying, like, couldn't we actually, and wouldn't another way of dealing with this be to either ignore offensive costumes or talk to people about them? Your students, your adults, you could go talk to somebody if they've offended you in some way, but is it something that the administration needs to deal with? So that's the email she sent out. Many of the students really kind of flipped out. They were angry, like incredibly angry at Erica Christakis for sending this email, for questioning at all whether the university should deal with the Halloween costumes.
Were there videos of this, and did it go like somewhat viral?
Yeah.
I think I've seen one.
It was, so you can look this up. They surrounded Nicholas on campus and began shouting at him,
and they were telling him, "Don't talk, don't talk." Yeah, I did see that.
And cursing at him, and saying things like, "Who the F hired you?" And they said that they, which is odd anyway, because they're attacking Nicholas. I mean, they do, they're husband and wife and did run the college, that residential college together. But it was, but they're attacking him about his wife's email. They said that it had created an unsafe space, right? Using that terminology again, right? They're questioning of, whether universities should be involved in policing Halloween costumes, created an unsafe environment. So students, it wasn't just, they're not expressing just that they're offended, but that they're made unsafe, that it's almost like an act of violence against them.
Like there were people crying, right?
They were crying and screaming and cursing and all that. Yeah. And, he initially kind of was apologetic, trying to just assuage them, and explaining to them that he was on their side. So Nicholas Christakis is on the left. This isn't Milo Yiannopoulos. This is not even a conservative. He's somebody who's on the left, and that's kind of why he was appealing to them, saying, like, I care about your issues too, but this didn't help. And so there was the screaming and the cursing and demands that they resign, and they did. They ended up leaving.
Wow.
So they're no longer then the headmasters of Silliman College. And Erica Christakis left Yale entirely. This was the effect of that, actually having them resign and leave their position.
Did the administration or the university defend them or have any stance on that?
It was very tepid if they defended them at all. There was a small group of professors who wrote something in defense. I think it was very small. But no, mostly kind of
Just let them
distancing
go.
and letting it go. And certainly no vigorous defense of them. Again, like this isn't, this wasn't an issue even just about free speech for offensive opinions. The opinion expressed wasn't anything people would normally see as offensive. This was and to not even get that kind of vigorous defense was, I guess, part of the reason they ended up resigning. So that happened in the fall of 2015. A little less than a year after our article had come out, we predicted that victimhood culture would begin to spread. But then you had another instance like that.
Brett
and it was
Weinstein,
kind of
right?
Brett Weinstein in 2017, which is the most...
Oh, that was only 2017?
Yeah, I mean, so this is, it's kind of...
Feels like it's been a long time.
It's been amazing. Yeah, it's been amazing to us, not only just how fast it is gone, but then now it's been 3 years of this, and it keeps happening. And so the Brett Weinstein case is probably the most egregious one in terms of the outcome, but the case with the Christakises is also kind of was something that you'd see as bizarre if you hadn't been following this culture, right? Because you have these people on the left making an argument, being attacked this way, but you also Brett Weinstein is also on the left, also somebody who's not a conservative, but he had been criticizing more strongly than the Christakises at some of the trends on campus. So this was at Evergreen State College, and they had a tradition of a day of absence where minority students, like students of color, would leave, and faculty too, I think, would leave campus for the day. So many of them at least. So like it was a day of absence, kind of like, and the idea was just to show their presence at the university. So when they're absent, it shows like how important they are, that kind of thing. So so it was a day of absence. They'd been doing it for a number of years. But in 2017, the organizers decided they would change it slightly. And so for the day of absence, rather than having like the non-white students and faculty leave, they were asking the white students and faculty to leave instead. So Weinstein objected to this, and he wrote that that it was very different to have a group decide themselves to leave as a kind of protest than to ask another group to leave, which he saw as a kind of discrimination in itself, kind of a kind of racism. And so he objected to that. And actually, it was like another month later or something when the incident happened, but it was about his objections. But a group of students surrounded him, started screaming at him, cursing at him, like the Christakis case, kind of. But they were, this is where they were, and he would say, kind of, "Can I talk for a minute?" And they would scream, "No!" And they were, calling him a racist, all these things. And then eventually, what happened in that situation? The campus police said that they couldn't ensure his safety, and so he started holding class off campus. And he ended up resigning entirely. So he and his wife both left Evergreen State, and they sued. They got a settlement for $500,000 or something, but they're no longer even at the college. So because of that complaint about the day of absence. So again, usually the kind of thing people would debate and not something where there's an obviously correct position. And again, like in terms of how the administration responded, the president of Evergreen State College is George Bridges, and he came out right after all this was happening and getting news attention and stuff, and the students had surrounded Weinstein and threatened him and all. And he congratulated the students, thanked them.
I saw that video too. I think they were mocking him, weren't they?
Oh yeah.
With the hand movements, and he was doing like some very common hand, like this or something.
They told him to put
your hands down.
Put his hands down, and then he put his hands behind his back, and even said, I think he said, "Oh, my hands are behind my back now," as if like he's.
And they were laughing.
And they laughed at him, and then there was. It might not be at the same time, I don't know, but sometime during all this, they were occupying his office and stuff, and they held them there. They wouldn't let them leave, and so like keeping the administrators there. And at one point, he asked them if he could leave to go to the restroom, and they said no. So this was the kind of like mockery. I think they did end up letting him go to the restroom.
Oh, so they let him go to the bathroom.
They did, but initially it was like, but that's the kind of demeaning of, may I have permission to go to the restroom? But he subjected himself to that and didn't push back. I think later he started making, but after everything blew up like this and all this, he started making some statements in favor of free speech and things like that. But initially, he supported the students, the activist students. Again, it's not like all students support this. He supported the activists who were attacking Weinstein, and certainly didn't support Brett Weinstein. So that was So those are just a couple of cases. There was a recent one, just like in the last few weeks. There was an article in the New York Times called, and it was about the liberal skew of faculty. Or not faculty, of administrators. So it's called something like think faculty are liberal, try administrators, and it's about it was simply about the fact that while the liberal skew for faculty is about 6 to 1 liberals for liberals for every conservative, it's about 12 to 1 for administrators. And so these, not all administrators, it's like student-facing administrators. So it's people who run student life and things like that. So the professor who wrote it is at Sarah Lawrence College, which is kind of near Manhattan, small college. Female only?
Or used to be anyway? Used to be.
Yeah, it may have been, yeah, probably was. I forgot his name, so I got into the story without knowing.
The New York Times author.
So the author. Anyway, the idea was he got vilified immediately. So he's a professor there. The students, they're activist students who tried to break into his office. Apparently, they tore down a picture of his newborn son off of his door. There was an emergency meeting of the student senate about this article in the New York Times. This is the New York Times, so it's not like he wrote an article in Breitbart News or something. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and he's a conservative-leaning professor. But this is the reaction, and the president of Sarah Lawrence College met with him, and she suggested that he should have cleared it with her before he published it, and that he had created a hostile work environment by publishing the op-ed. That she even asked him if he was on the job market, which he took to mean like you should be, like maybe you should be leaving. But all this because of his article saying that there was this left-wing skew among administrators, and that a lot of what he was arguing is that microaggression training, all these kinds of things often come from like the Office of Student Life. It's not so much professors indoctrinating people in their classrooms, it's these other kinds of institutions on campus. And it's like, and there you have the left-wing skew even greater, and that's one of the causes for it. So again, that kind of hostile reaction to any kind of criticism. And I guess I should point out, it's also fairly arbitrary. It's not like every time somebody makes an argument that they get attacked and vilified and their office broken into or surrounded. So this is part of what is, can be unusual in the specific cases. It allows for a lot of people to kind of downplay the importance of it, to say, oh, there's not really this big problem. Why don't I see it? Like people make, and it is true, there are people making arguments, conservative arguments, or liberals making, taking issue with things on the far left, or that goes on campus. Most people aren't attacked, but sometimes they are. And so, and they're attacked for saying things that are not out of the mainstream or not particularly unusual. Even this case where it's actually, printed in the New York Times as if they would have, they're not going to print some kind of right-wing screed. It was a thoughtful article presenting original research.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.